cause of the rise of China and the rise of Asia.
Well, as the president said,
go ahead. No.
The president said in your thing, we have everything going for us. And by the way, even unemployment is low. Our science is great. We're creating new ways to
philanthropy.
We're, editing the genome with CRISPRs. We're inventing all sorts of new things. They're going to change everything. And our politics has gotten in the way, and it's almost because the structures of politics have fallen apart. The notion of political parties have lost control. The notion of the Senate being the Senate has lost control.
The notion of political parties.
That to me is one of the central lessons of this campaign, is that so much of the theory about how political parties work, even in this age, I think has been just thrown into a cocked hat. I mean, the idea that it's not just that Trump engendered a hostile takeover, where I don't think there was a single member of the governing wing of that party that was for him. But it's also that none of his policy positions, if they happen to coincide with the Republican Party, it's by accident. And the guardrails or the tripwires that normally you would have thought of would have stopped this. Like if George Wallace had been the leading candidate in 1972, back then the Democratic tripwires would have stopped him. He would have been the nominee.
In fact, we sort of had that on the Democratic side, which is that the DNC, according to the hacked emails and everything, said, okay, let's try to help get this thing done, and with Hillary. And that was actually a good thing. That's what a party should do.
Let's avoid false equivalence. Bernie Sanders. I know Bernie Sanders. He is no Donald Trump.
We're on to something important, which is the parties need to reestablish control. If they mean anything at all, having some sense of influence on the nominating process. I mean, it all happened because of my guy, Teddy Roosevelt, in 1912, when he wanted to beat Taft, who had the party delegates behind him because he was the sitting president. He introduced this whole let the people vote, and a primary system happened. And for a long period of time, then the primaries went out, they came back in again, and yet the superdelegates still represented, as they did on the Democratic side, the party on the Democratic side holding some power. Republicans made a decision some years ago, 4 years ago, that they were going to reduce the number of superdelegates, and they were going to have to vote like their states voted. I think we need to think about, do we really want the primaries? I know this doesn't sound democratic, but do we want the party leaders, if they're going to try and get consensus, if they mean anything at all, to have a little bit more control when the decision is made as to who the nominee is? And, in 1912, when this fight got so vitriolic between Teddy and Taft, the New York Times wrote an editorial, and they said, if this is our first experiment under this new primary system, we sincerely hope it's our last. This is a mob. People from abroad must be looking at us, and we must be blushing at what we're appearing to be. And my God, that could be written today.
Well, and since 1968, 1972, of course, is when this more democratic, small d, democratic primary system emerged. At the same time, the very same time that the decline in faith in institutions began unabated.
And
I don't think those are...
of the media happened. All three. Perfect storm.
So it's...
But it's Kurt's point about the decline of faith in institutions, also a global thing. I mean, in England, Great Britain, you were not supposed to have sort of referenda and pure democracy. Things were supposed to be done in Parliament. And now they're fighting that out.
A referendum on Brexit.
Well, now they're fighting out. Who controls things in Great Britain? Is it Parliament, which is the way the Constitution says, or is it these sort of referenda, like primaries?
I just think that's so central. There was one little is the phrase data point? Am I correct? Piece of information. So, if I'm right about this, and I think I am, so last year was the hottest year on record. That's not an opinion. It doesn't tell you why, climate change, who knows what. It turns out that either a significant minority or majority of Trump voters do not believe that last year was the hottest year on record, which is one step short of saying, so 2 + 2 is 4?
No, but it happens all the time. There's a lot of data that shows that the more you show people data that says that vaccines do not cause autism, the less they believe it. And that we're just living in that world at the moment because people have very strong views.
They are entitled to their own facts.
Right.
But...
Monet had famously said, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts.
Exactly. But what do we make? It's a related fact that in this election, for the first time since polling began, college-educated whites are voting, the Democratic presidential candidate is winning college-educated whites. Is that because college-educated people are more able to see the empirical truth than non-college
You want to
educated.
talk about Twitter?
Although I do think, to talk about Twitter thing, the notion of anonymity and being able to say really brutal, bullying things anonymously did not exist in our
And
society.
that's what happened in our politics this season too.
Right.
It wasn't anonymous. It was said out public in ways that we hadn't heard.
Exactly, and not in a dog whistle way, and it's racial.
It's foghorns.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's I also
The coarseness of our
I thought the notion
dumbing down
that one
coarseness.
of the Trump people, when they were asked, well, Comey now says there was nothing in the emails, and they said on the record, yeah, but it damaged her. Now, there was a time, maybe a political.
We would say that privately. Say it privately.
But that was we know it wasn't.
But in terms of this getting to the party leaders being in charge, it's not going to happen. I mean, you don't put the toothpaste back in the tube, and the more that you have democracy, the more that you have democracy, and the ability
The
to.
Democratic Convention in 1968.
I know.
It
From
was-
Connecticut. Senator from,
Oh, no.
Senator from Connecticut.
No, I'm talking about your mom.
76 was my mom.
76.
68 was the senator.
Breakdown.
Yeah, my father was platform chairman in
That was,
68.
I mean, that's when, as Kurt said,
Right.
68 to 72.
But, I think in this point, Koki's warning about nostalgia is very useful, because back then, the idea that the nominee of the Democratic Party had never contested in a primary and just sailed it on the votes of leaders, that was not considered a good thing.
Right.
That was considered a bug, to use
Hubert Humphrey, right.
Yeah, let me just brace this other question. We have had in the last several years, more conflict between law enforcement and African Americans. Whether it's more or we just know more about it. But here is a racial conflict, and we just had 8 years of an African American president, and yet there seems to be, a rising of that tension at that level. Are we making no progress?
Oh, sure, we're making progress again. I think we do know more about it, and I think that what's happening is in police departments around the country that there's a lot of effort.
And in fact, you see in a lot of these police departments where they're having this happen, the police chief is African American.
Right, but I think there's a lot of realization of this, and people are making an effort to educate police departments and the citizenry, and there's a lot of goodwill around this, even though we're going through a very bad patch on it.
But one of the things,
I think
what it has done also is caused us to re-examine the legacy of slavery.
Well, that's a good thing.
And that's the great accomplishments of civil rights, as great as they were legalistic accomplishments. There is, a half century later, we're still working on it, and I think it's hugely a matter of we're aware of it because everybody has a camera in their pockets, and that's a good thing, a painfully good thing about technology.
Ezra Edelman's documentary on O.J.
Yes,
Simpson,
indeed.
one of its most important points, to Koki's point, is it documents, going back all through at least the 40s, the incidents where African Americans were killed by Los Angeles police without accountability. In fact, that's one of his explanations to what happened at the O.J. case. So the idea that, I agree with you that in an age when everybody has a smartphone, we see it more. But the idea that this has been a rising phenomenon, I think, is belied by the facts.
But I think it's very important that we know it.
Yeah, and in fact, something good may come out of that, the fact that we know it and recognize it.
During the business about the police brutality, and Mr. Trump said to the African American community, things are worse now than they've ever been for you, worse than 60, 70 years ago. That's simply not true. I mean, not only are these events that have been going on in the cities probably happened before without accountability, but more importantly, worse than before blacks had the right to vote, worse than when they were discriminated against in the South and they couldn't go into a bathroom on the street. I mean, we have to not let this shadow of what we imagine is happening overtake the reality of what's actually happening.
You could argue that you could argue that big city governments has failed to address some real simmering
But
problems.
he said that
Ever since the inner city has problems of education, of mobility, of wealth, of everything together that makes it hard to deal with the city's problem. But things are certainly better than they
And
were
nobody
50,
has
60 years ago.
benefited more from the astonishing reduction in violent crime in America in the last 25 years. Nobody's benefited more than African Americans.
But you know what he was saying when he said, "No, but you've never had it worse." He said that in white communities, and he said it in poor white communities. And look, you and I, and to some degree you're younger, grew up in the Jim Crow South. We know exactly what that was. That was saying, you guys, there's somebody you're still better than them. That's what that was.
Yeah, the notion that this brought out racism in our society, that this campaign, you were allowed to play on racial hatred, that to me is the most shocking and depressing thing
Well,
about
one
this
of the
campaign.
questions that's being asked is, did somehow the campaign legitimize the nativist and some of the worst elements?
Yes.
Because they were, yes.
That's the part of the Republican
And
Party
legitimize people
takeover that is most shocking. That's what I mean by the
and
tripwire
also
was
against
going.
women. Legitimize feelings about race and legitimize feelings about
violence against
women.
women.
The course and dialogue allowed all of that to come out, and people might have been feeling it internally, but then they can say it publicly. Every night we see it. We see it on the internet. I mean, that's a lasting impact. That's one of the places I feel pessimistic about the nature of this
Violence
campaign.
against women. It's that whole business of she doesn't have the stamina. It's that whole business of women are weak. She's, she
And
doesn't.
they're nasty
and she
if
doesn't
they-
look
if they are
presidential.
argumentative.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this campaign has actually given political correctness a good name. I want to go back to saying you're not supposed to say those things, and because as Shakespeare taught us, we become the mask we wear. And so if we just say no, even in locker rooms, we don't say that about blacks, we don't say it about women, then we're a better
That's a
society.
really good point, because political correctness, we can all cite our examples of, oh my God, too much political correctness. But there's a question of civility, decency, and
Absolutely.
that don't throw that baby out with the
Erasing the
bathwater.
line between people who think kung po